OR Tambo's call to render South Africa ungovernable and apartheid machinery unworkable. The democratic dispensation of 1994 is a product of this and many other unsung heroes, not the kindness of racists who succumbed to revolutionary spirit of resistance. It is a day that has come to be known as Freedom Day, as it was a day that was meant to be the first step towards the liberation of our people. We must remember this day and celebrate its victories while also reflecting on its shortcomings. The 27th of April is remembered as a day where we achieved political freedom after years of negotiations between the liberation movement and the apartheid regime. As revolutionaries, it is important that we remember this day as an important transition to a democratic dispensation, but not where we achieved independence. It was a nation such as Burkina Faso, where Thomas Sankara seized the land and built a productive agricultural and industrial economy and refused to pay colonial debt, where independence was achieved. It was in Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah built economy with Africans at the center, championing calls for continental unity for independent Africa, where independence was achieved. It was in the economically sabotaged Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe enforced the agreements of the Lancaster Agreement after being betrayed by Britain, where independence was achieved. In South Africa, the 27th of April is a day where we achieved political freedom, but not economic and independence. Many sacrifices and compromises were made which saw the economy remain in the hands of the oppressor. The likes of President Nelson Mandela did this with the hope that political power will be used to wrestle our economy from the hands of the white minority. Unfortunately, this has not been done. Those who control our apartheid economy use their power to control our political landscape. They stifle all efforts that will see the freedom of black people from their position as gardeners and domestic workers in our economy. We therefore remain permanent intents of white monopoly capital abused by racists in their homes, in their workplaces, and in society in general. As all of this happens, the liberation movement has lost its teeth and become ally of those who make our people to be servants in our own land. It continues to fulfill its mandate as a mediator between African people and white minority rule, using political power to protect the interest of imperialism. It is a liberation movement that has fallen to greed, selfishness, and corruption. It is a liberation movement that has failed to use its political power to industrialize our economy, build independent capacity in all sectors, and create a developmental nation of the wealth of the land. As early as 1900, the land of black people was taken from them through violent colonial dispossession and subjugation of our people to governments and laws that never took part in establishing. Despite these realities, we still have a constitution in South Africa that says that those who wish to reclaim their land should only reclaim the land that was taken after June 1913. The reality is that by 1913, more than 80% of land that belonged to Africans was taken through wars of dispossession. The consequence of landlessness of our people are still living with us to this day, because black people and Africans in particular are the most affected by high levels of poverty, unemployment, and homelessness. The struggle for the return of the land is at the center of our struggle and cannot and should not be suspended even at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic has brought into sharp focus the landlessness of our people. Our people are cramped in informal settlement townships, and majority do not have small pieces of land to plant crops during this difficult period. The gains of 1994 have therefore become useless, and South Africans continue to witness a degeneration of their conditions. We are today going to make some key reflections on corona pandemic, its impact on the economy, and what has been government response thus far. From the beginning, we as the EFF have pledged our support to government. We fully support the lockdown because, unlike many other viruses and disease, corona is a highly contagious disease which easily spreads from human to human and sometimes can infect people just by touching surface where it is. We call on all our people to remain disciplined and obedient to all the regulations that have been announced by government. We should maintain high standards of hygiene and must not leave our homes even when it is not necessary. We know that this is a difficult period, but all available evidences has demonstrated that corona is highly infectious and can easily transmit from one person to another. The corona outbreak has brought into sharpest focus the economic, social, and spatial inequalities that exist between black and white people in South Africa. Even when they want to be in self-isolation, our people do not have spacious houses to isolate into because they stay in shacks. Even when they want to keep maximum hygiene standards, a huge number of our people do not have access to clean water. The coronavirus has exposed sharply the economic freedom fighters has been raising since its formation. The outbreak of corona has demonstrated that every nation needs stable, dependable, and capable government with sovereign capacity to generate own revenue and will to build independent industrial and manufacturing capacity to produce critical goods, equipment, and services. Neoliberal economists and politicians have for years been arguing for a small and weak government which must only administer regulations when the private sector provides all other services, including healthcare, education, and all other critical services. The current corona pandemic has demonstrated that the private sector cannot be relied upon for the provision of basic services for all our people, particularly health services. Big business, whether black or white, is not loyal to any nation and does not care about the people. They are only loyal to profits. The coronavirus has demonstrated that big capitalists from Stellenbosch and Oppenheimers are not friends of government and are not at all defined by patriotism. The patriotism of big business in South Africa and everywhere in the world is towards profit maximization, not towards a people. That is why even in these times of need, big businesses continue to be self-seeking and their contribution comes nowhere close to the minerals, wealth, and cheap labor of the people they have exploited over the years. The coronavirus has demonstrated that politicians from the ruling party cannot be trusted with the lives of our people. That is why they steal and loot food even in the darkest hour of need. They distribute food and water in partisan way and worse at a time through factional means during these difficult times, when we are supposed to put aside our differences and unite against the invisible enemy. The coronavirus has demonstrated that the slow pace of delivering of communications and infrastructure and usage of technology, as we called for in our manifesto, has huge impact on the education of particularly poor and rural masses. The coronavirus has also vindicated the progressive policies of the economic freedom fighters on the question of land, jobs, industrialization, education, social grants, and constant provision of quality health care for all. As a result, we are going to present concrete short and long-term solutions on what is to be done. The following criteria will be covered: healthcare provision, social assistance, education, the economy, solidarity with African continent, and poor nations. Some of the interventions we'll announce here have been contained in the many media statements we've issued and many letters we have written to the President and members of the executive. All public representatives have committed a third of our monthly salaries to fight against coronavirus. What this means is that for 3 months, the EFF councillors, members of provincial legislature, and members of parliament will have contributed millions into the fight against coronavirus. So while councillors from other political parties, MPLs and MPs are stealing food parcels from poor people and are arrested for drinking and driving, violations of the lockdown regulations by driving with alcohol in their cars, we in the EFF are sacrificing our salaries so that we can defeat the coronavirus. We will be directly involved in interventions against extreme levels of poverty and negligence by government, and this will be on case-by-case basis. Our public representatives in Metsimaholo are at the forefront of provision of basic water and other essential services to the people of Metsimaholo. Our public representatives have been helping in different informal settlement throughout the country, and this informal settlement must be made formal. They have been fighting nonsensical evictions carried out by municipalities. Our public representatives in Cape Town have been preventing municipality from evicting poor people from their areas of residence. Our public representatives have been involved in overseeing the work carried by government and have opened many police cases against acts of corruption by politicians from the ruling party. The EFF's proposal and recommendations are therefore informed by the real struggles of our people in communities, because that is where we are. Our proposals and interventions as the EFF are aimed at saving lives, and we agree with the observation made by the President of Ghana that whilst we all have the capacity and knowledge to revive collapsed economies, we all don't know how to breathe life into dead bodies. We must make sure that we continue to be responsible. In terms of health provisions, we as the EFF believe that government should use this period to build permanent healthcare systems and infrastructure that will respond to all needs of our people. Instead of temporary hospitals, government should build an extended network of hospitals, clinics, polyclinics in all wards, townships, informal settlements, and villages. Government must make sure that some of the hotels, lodges, and other hospitality infrastructure must be converted into quality healthcare facilities, and some must be permanent for provision of primary healthcare to our people. The screening and testing of communities must not be done only during this period, but must form part of South Africa's health system going forward, including outreach campaigns to educate our people about preventative measures, as it is the case now with coronavirus. Government should convert existing government infrastructure that is not being used for anything into accessible quality healthcare facilities. This should not be temporary, because South Africa's health burden is one of the most devastating health burdens in the world. The population of South Africa is less than 1% of the global population, but more than 15% of HIV/AIDS related deaths come from South Africa. The defeat of corona must also mean that we deal with the heavy disease burden that defines our country. In the same way many countries built military reserves post-World War II, we should build healthcare reserves where ordinary citizens, professionals in other fields are trained, capacitated in the essential of primary health care. Soldiers, teachers, police, councillors, members of provincial legislatures, members of parliament must be provided with basic training to administer primary health care, such as diseases, detection, screening, and administering of first aid care to all people. South Africa should build its pharmaceutical capacity to produce generic medicines and vaccines. We are aware that sometime the Cuban Center for Genetic Engineering has attempted to build relations with South Africa, and that was not given maximum attention. Now is the time to revive and strengthen the relationship with Cuba and build pharmaceutical capacity to produce our own medicine, not only for South Africa, but for the entire African continent. Our country currently imports more than 30 billion of pharmaceutical products from other parts of the world. It is high time we begin to produce our own medicines. South Africa should begin to locally manufacture and produce medical equipment, including ventilators. The South African government currently owns Denel, which produces high-tech fighting machines and aeroplanes. That capacity must be directed towards the production of medical equipment. How do we explain that we can build fighter jets in Denel, fighting flying machines, but we cannot build a ventilator which helps people to breathe? Why do we have capacity to produce machines, guns to fight wars, but cannot produce machines to save lives? The CSIR should be given maximum support and capacity to produce medical equipment, and the CSIR supported programs to produce test kits by black South Africans must be given maximum support. There is currently no sound reason why our country cannot produce its own masks, which are needed in the containment of coronavirus. We need to build local industrial capacity to produce our own medical equipment. The corona pandemic must be a clarion call that we need to build inward industrial capacity and not completely rely on the West and East for the provision of basic necessities. Since our formation as the economic freedom fighters, we have called for the doubling of social grants for old people, child support grant, disability grants, and all other grants that are provided by the state for those who cannot help themselves. We fully welcome the increase of social grants and the introduction of basic income grant for unemployed people. Our demand in this regard is simple. These increases must be made permanent. The old age grant must never be reduced and must instead be increased to 2,800 per month. The child support grant must not be reduced, but increased instead to be 800 per month. The basic income grant must not be reversed and must instead be increased to 1,000 per month. These interventions in boosting local economic activities and in the reduction of poverty for our people, not only during this period, but forever. We want to caution the current government that if you want peace in this country, you should keep the basic income grant for all our people who do not have jobs and are not employed, and it must be increased. Some provincial governments have established temporary shelters for homeless people, and we appreciate this development. What we will not appreciate is to take homeless people back to the street immediately after the containment of corona. South Africa, let us be among some of the few countries in the world to abolish homelessness. The homeless people currently housed by government should be rehabilitated and integrated back into normal society. The election manifesto of the EFF made a commitment that all learners and students must be given access to computers and other essential technological learning devices such as tablets, and the ruling party commitment to provide this was never adhered to. The corona outbreak and the lockdown vindicates our position, and we demand, even under the current circumstances, that government must provide laptops and tablets to all learners and students. All educational content in South Africa now must and forever be zero rated in terms of data costs. When ICASA issued Vodacom, MTN, and Cell C and all other networks with spectrum, they made commitment to install internet in schools, provide computers, laptops. These companies have reported that government has not come to the party and is not leading and telling them where to install the internet or where to take computers and laptops to. We must find new ways of facilitating learning and teaching, and now is the time to go to all these companies and demand that they play a far much direct and practical role. There must not be a learner or a student anywhere in South Africa without a laptop and tablet that does not have internet. We demand that government must work with content developers to ensure that all these laptops, tablets, and computers are preloaded with learning material. It cannot be that only children of the rich and mostly whites continue to learn. Institutions of higher learning, of higher education should not leave any student behind, and this is the time institutions of higher learning should be consolidating resources, aligning systems, and teaching from a central system where possible. All universities and post-secondary institutions must distribute laptops and tablets to our students, to all students. Like we said with healthcare equipment, we should build internal capacity to produce electronic devices and gadgets that will assist with teaching and learning. We need reliable network infrastructure, particularly in rural areas. The SABC must provide educational programs both on radio and TV. Yeah, there is no freedom without free quality decolonized education. In realizing this dream, there is an absolute necessity to free all existing educational institutions from early childhood development to university from racist capitalist education. The sustainability of freedom depends on education, a free, quality, and decolonized education system that does not reproduce a racist history of Africa and of black bodies. A decolonized education exposes white supremacy and teaches black pride, pride in Africa and not despise of African continent and its people, whilst reproducing an admiration of Europe and whiteness. This education system must have a new way of teaching, learning, and a new curriculum. The reality, however, is that we could never ask racists to give us such education. The progressive movement must inspire new decolonized curriculum in learning and teaching systems from early childhood development up to universities. Each progressive researcher has to take it upon themselves to reimagine new ways of teaching black children to find their own history, culture, and languages as worthy of admiration. A new curriculum that produces confidence and pride in black children without hating their skin color and thinking only white things are worthy of emulation. This indeed an important struggle, and EFF cannot wait to be in government first before engaging in it. We have already taken a decision to start a new school from scratch, the Winnie Mandela Combined School. We have already bought the land on which to build the school. We have contacted the Winnie Mandela family regarding the name of the school, regarding the naming of the school after Mama Winnie Mandela. Over the next 5 years, we will work day and night to establish this school along with the values of decolonization and socialism. It will be an independent school from EFF with its own independent and highly qualified board of trustees. It will be a school for the poor, dejected, and talented black children. Its admission policy will be based on prioritization of poor orphans from who lost their parents to HIV and AIDS, poor victims of domestic violence, and the poor black people in general. We will provide these children of the poor with the best world-class facilities that includes sports, recreation, and arts, as well as highly qualified teachers. The EFF is not a rich political party. Its constituency is not rich people. But through this initiative, we hope to inspire those with some wealth in the black community to start emulating our example. Let us start to build well-equipped school for talented black children instead of wasting money on private jets, expensive holiday mansions in islands of luxury. There is no better investment than the education of a black child. Such an education must be unapologetically decolonized if it is to produce a kind of confident black who does not worship whiteness or seek after its approval. This is the kind of black being that can only be produced by a free decolonized education system. Such a black being will lead us all into prosperous Africa in peace with itself. Fellow fighters, while we battle against the invisible enemy known as coronavirus, the gains that were made in 1994 of political freedom are being misused and reversed. Through our political freedom, we have been given an opportunity to draft legislation that will change the lives of our people. It is our political freedom that allowed us to gain control over state-owned enterprises. That is where, to be used correctly, can be the foundation of an independent economy. It is our political freedom that ought to guide how our economy operates, how our banking system functions, how the wealth of the country is distributed equally. The current conditions are not reflective of these possibilities. Instead, of the politics guiding the markets and economy in South Africa. It is capital that controls and guides our politics. As a result, we find ourselves at the mercy of what white big business demands and the mining industrial complex comprised of Rupert's and Oppenheimers. It is because of this misuse of political power in this country that we find our SOEs being sabotaged and collapsed so that they can be sold to the highest bidders. In this way, the little that is left of our sovereignty is being surrendered, and all possibilities of economic freedom and independence are being destroyed. SAA today has been killed by Pravin Gordhan, who, after undermining the business rescue process and collapsing government plans to rescue SAA, wants to behave like a savior by delaying retrenchments of workers. These very retrenchments are engineered by him. We will now witness hundreds of SAA workers being retrenched during a health crisis, and we will emerge from coronavirus without a national airline. Eskom is facing a similar fate as energy production is surrendered to capital after the deliberate sabotage through load shedding and political bullying by Pravin Gordhan. It is the same bullying and arrogance that sees Gordhan undermine the Eskom board and SAA business rescue practitioners, resulting in the collapse of these entities. It is Pravin Gordhan's arrogance that led to the likes of Jan Jachana resigning from SAA because of constant interference and undermining of the rescue of SAA. The gains of the 1994 democratic transition are today undermined by the same cabal that compromised on the demands for independence at the negotiation table. Leading these efforts is one Pravin Gordhan. These are the current conditions that fundamentally undermine what those who came before us fought for. Commissars, fighters and ground forces, and the people of South Africa, the economy of South Africa post-corona must not have the same features as the economy before and during coronavirus pandemic. We demand that all state-owned companies be protected and some should be repurposed. Workers should not be retrenched, particularly those of SAA and Eskom. If there should be anyone who should be retrenched, it is Pravin Gordhan himself, Jamnandas. We demand that in the immediate, government must build and support internal capacity to manufacture and produce basic essentials, not only in the health sector, but in all other critical sectors. We demand that government should, in the immediate, build food sovereignty, meaning that the South Africa must build capacity to produce food for all its people and must extend that capacity to produce food for the entire African continent. Food sovereignty requires that South Africa must decisively deal with the land question. In the immediate, all available state-owned land must be availed to black small-scale farmers and people who want to produce for survival. The state must support them with agricultural implements and guarantee offtake of agricultural products from these individuals. Food production and the entire food value chain must not be left to the control of the white farmers, multinational packaging companies, and monopoly retailers. The South African government must finalize the process of building a state bank and ensure that all recipients of social grants, basic income grants, use the state bank for the receipt of all their grants. Amidst the difficulties it is facing, government must re-nationalize Sasol and decisively prevent any attempt for the takeovers of Sasol by multinational corporations, particularly from China and the West. The Public Investment Corporation must look into increasing its shares in Sasol and partner with government to ensure that it is owned and controlled in South Africa. We must reject any attempt to privatize South African Airways and demand that all workers, both in SAA and SA Express, be paid their salaries and keep their jobs. Government must stick to their commitment, to the commitment they made to save SAA, employ capable and competent management, and do away with business models that have not worked for the SAA. This means SAA must buy its own aircraft instead of leasing and cancel all inflated contracts. Fellow fighters, it is not a secret that continue to depend on International Monetary Fund and World Bank will place a lot of nations, particularly African countries, in a state of permanent crisis and poverty. We refuse that government must take loans from the IMF and World Bank because IMF loans have been used in the whole African continent as an instrument of recolonization, and we do not want to sacrifice our independence because of situations we can domestically manage. Historically, the IMF and the World Bank have been interested in the development of the people, have not been interested in development of people as a whole, except the few people in America and Britain. As we all know, all they have done is spread misery, pain, unemployment, hunger, and crisis. They've done so in Brazil, Argentina, in Ghana, in Zambia, Angola, even here in South Africa. It is not true that the IMF and World Bank loans do not have conditions. IMF says the levels of access to its loans depends on countries' balance sheets, capacity to repay, the members' outstanding fund credit, and other conditions. In addition to these conditions, the IMF further says a country is required to cooperate with the IMF to make efforts to solve its balance of payments difficulties and to describe the general economic policies that it proposes to follow. What this means is that conditionality will apply to South Africa if it proceeds to borrow money from the IMF. The IMF and the World Bank is not an option. We should be made to believe there is no ideology with people whose ideas have never produced any human progress. Instead of the IMF and World Bank, we believe that South Africa should look into the following options. Unclaimed benefits. There are billions of rands of unclaimed benefits and money in insurance companies which have been generated through profits of workers' pensions. Government must look into this as a source of the money we need during this crisis. Government reserves. Government must use its own reserves and reprioritize funds from unnecessary government budgets into fight against coronavirus. Let us investigate the foreign exchange reserves held by the South African Reserve Bank. Let us have an open debate on whether the Reserve Bank cannot use further instruments other than the interest rates to allow more money into the economy and the National Revenue Fund. The most advanced industrial nations in the world, including the United Kingdom, have redirected resources from the Bank of England to fight the coronavirus. We are in a crisis, and we should internally exhaust all avenues to save our country from the crisis before we rush to the IMF and the World Bank. It is not true that the IMF and World Bank will not interfere with our independence and sovereignty even when we owe them money. The South African Reserve Bank must play a far much bigger role in making money available to government and the economy broadly. Comrades, in all these interventions, government should establish the strong and solid accountability mechanisms. All corrupt individuals must be charged, and government must be transparent about Solidarity Fund. We are aware that already those deployed in Solidarity Fund wants to operate outside the laws of the Republic. We are aware that those managing the Solidarity Fund want to appoint Bidvest and Imperial as the only companies that will buy and deliver all the essential needed to fight the coronavirus. President Ramaphosa must desist from using these key institutions to empower his friends and those who contributed to the CR17 campaign. This is not the time to please friends. We are in a war. We demand that all people who work for the Solidarity Fund, including board members and executives, should do so on voluntary basis. If they are not willing to perform their functions on voluntary basis, government should redeploy some of its administrators to go work in the Solidarity Fund. The theft and looting of food parcels by the ANC councillors is proof enough that these people cannot be trusted with the lives of our people. We have written to the president to demand that all councillors and all politicians must be removed from the delivery of food parcels, and we repeat the demand that no politician must be allowed to distribute food parcels during this period. All the tax benefits, especially the deferments that are given to companies, must benefit workers, and so far this is not clear. Big business must not be allowed to use the tax breaks provided now as instruments for tax avoidance. There is an attempt to manipulate our judiciary, and there is an attempt to capture it by white monopoly capital. We must be honest about transformation of our judiciary since 1994, and why its transformation is necessary. Our judiciary is still subject to the ideological perspective of the apartheid era, as many apartheid judges remain in our courts, and apartheid laws such as Riotous Assemblies Act remain in effect. It is a judiciary that is not guided by the politics that are needed to create a just and equal society based on justice and redress. The laws of our country and of any nation are created with politics in mind, and the current politics directing judicial sector protect the rights of those who have benefited from the suffering of the African majority. The dignity of our people cannot be restored because the land rights of the benefactors of colonialism are protected. Our legal system is used to fight political battles and escape accountability in the same manner that apartheid president used the legal system to escape accountability and manipulate the judicial system. Today, the capture of our political system by those with money is defended by our courts, and documents implicating the state president and funders are sealed from the public. Judges are used to defend illegal rogue units that spy on political opponents and undermine constitutional rights to privacy and misuse tax agencies to settle political scores. Chapter 9 institutions are attacked for seeking transparency and justice against those who abuse our political system in service of corruption and intimidation. In the midst of all of this, institutions that are supposed to defend our freedoms gained in 1994, such as NGOs and the media, are complicit, choosing sides in the political arena. These are the current conditions that undermine the spirit and the memory of political freedom that we fought for and that we are celebrating today. We are aware that the crisis brought by COVID-19 will affect artists and entertainers the most. Majority of these people depend on festivals and events to make a living. Because of this necessity for social distancing, it is clear that we will not see concerts, parties, weddings, festivals, and other gatherings through which they make a living. Accordingly, we have taken a decision to financially support all artists that have been with the EFF from inception. All musicians and entertainers who have ever been on our stage or events will get financial support to help ease the economic burden brought by COVID-19. The reality is that these artists would have been with us today if our rally had taken place to commemorate Freedom Day. They will be with us on June 16, Africa Day, our anniversary on the 26th July, our Women's Day celebration, Heritage Day, and many other events. With the little we have, we'll support them, we'll remember them in this difficult hour because they've always been with us. We want to use this opportunity to caution government against premature reopening of the economy, most of which is influenced by big businesses who are not making profits during this period. We were inspired and encouraged when the Minister of Health brought experts and professors to address the nation on scientific reading of the current period. We, however, do not understand the science behind the premature reopening of the economy. The reality is that majority of workers who will go back to work prematurely are black people, and knowing the negligence of big business in South Africa, particularly mines, our people will be at the risk of contracting the virus. Government must be cautioned now that if workers contract the coronavirus and infect their families, friends, and communities, government and their capitalist friends must take full responsibility for murder and attempted genocide. Cyril Ramaphosa and all companies that are rushing into premature reopening must know that they will have blood in their hands if our people die as a result of their premature and reckless and senseless reopening of the economy. Each and every company that reopens during this period must be directly held accountable for the health and safety of the workers, and we as the EFF will make sure that no life is lost due to rushed and senseless reopening of the economy. Our submission is that for each worker that contracts the disease due to premature and senseless reopening, that company should pay a fine of 5 million to the family of the deceased. It must strictly be scientific basis that should necessitate the reopening of the economy. We are called upon to survive under lockdown regulations, and the past month South Africans has demonstrated that we can survive. Fellow fighters and ground forces, we must be honest if we are to change the course and ensure that sacrifices of our forefathers do not go to waste. It will take a brave generation to protect the gains of 1994 and take the baton to lead us towards economic freedom and independence. That generation must be a generation of Pan-Africanists. It is a generation that must understand that there is no free South Africa without a free Africa. There is no freedom in South Africa without the total liberation of the African continent. We must further the gains of political freedom by building an integrated African economy. Fellow fighters, we must defend our SOEs because without them there is no home for independent economic development. We must encourage African leaders to abandon their obsession with power and unite behind a common and immediate goal of an integrated political system towards one economy and one African state. Africa must have one government, a central economy, and one president. The tragedy of coronavirus gives us an opportunity to unite as a continent to develop out of this crisis a new economy. We must use this time to develop our industry, to develop our healthcare sector, and to develop trade relations. We must go back to the ideas of Gaddafi of an African economy and currency based on mineral wealth of our continent, not imaginary markets. Today, we see the likes of the United States of America printing money without consequences to the value of their currency. This is because they control the markets that determines the value of currencies. They do this without any gold, oil, or valuable mineral resources. We see the United States manipulating international institutions because they want to be the dominant global power. They do this at the expense of nations that have mineral and raw resources. For true freedom, we must unite with progressive international forces to combat imperialist powers. We must unite with Cuba, whose legacy is progressive and shows itself today through its deployment of medical staff and resources across the world to combat the coronavirus. We must emerge from this pandemic with an African economy that will give to the world a new human face. As we commemorate Freedom Day, let us keep in our hearts the less fortunate and those who are marginalized the most in our society. Let us protect one another. Let us protect women and children, the elderly and the disabled. Let us protect Africa and her children and be caring to all of her people. As many of our hard-fought freedoms are denied to us today in combat the spread of the coronavirus, let us all remember that most basic human right is the right to life. To protect this right, let us all remain in our homes and observe the guidelines given to us by our respective governments across the world. Fellow fighters, already in the 1950s, Frantz Fanon wrote about Africa as the wretched of the earth. He located racism directly at the people of African descent to be the greatest and most violent of all oppressions. All people of the world despise Africans. Nothing about Africans invites respect, dignity, humanness, and beauty in the eyes of the world. We represent slavery, underdevelopment, poverty, disease, hunger, suffering, and illiteracy. Everyone thinks they are better than an African. They can meet the worst form of suffering like Holocaust and gulags. They still will see themselves as better than Africans. Meaning, instead of human tragedy making them identify with Africans, they will still think of their own human suffering as better than being an African. Why? Because African is being trapped in a skin color, a body we can never escape. How do you escape being yourself? Such will only lead to self-destruction and permanent self-sabotage. These are our conditions and image in the world. Therefore, a genuine conversation about Freedom Day must reflect on this status of African people. The fact that these conditions have continued long after African continent have declared itself independent and free of colonial rule is a problem. The African body has not attained humanity and dignity in the eyes of itself, even in the eyes of those who inhabit it. It feels like a curse we want to escape, a burden we want to dump. With the global outbreak of coronavirus in Wuhan, China, the black body still found its way to bearing the blame for a virus that never came from its continent. In Guangzhou province, the home to Asia's largest African migrant population, a state-sponsored propaganda has come to blame African migrants for bringing and spreading COVID-19. The local authorities have identified Africa as the source of the largest number of imported COVID-19 cases. Among all foreign cases identified in Guangzhou, 76% are said to be from African countries, including 36% from Nigeria alone. How is it that a virus that originated from China somehow came to be blamed on the black bodies by the same Chinese authorities. In less than 100 days since the first case of coronavirus was reported in Wuhan, authorities in China are saying coronavirus is from Nigeria. The black body is so despised that it must be blamed for any disease anywhere in the world. As a result of this state propaganda, African migrants are being targeted in China, beaten up randomly on the street, not allowed into shopping malls, and evicted from buildings they rent. This tragic development during a time that requires global solidarity already shows you what the world is willing to do in order to put Africa in its rightful place. At the bottom, as an evil continent infecting the whole world with death and diseases. We must not forget that just before the global outbreak of COVID-19, the world was discussing the migrant crisis in Europe, mainly from African continent. Europe, in particular, countries like Italy, France, Spain, Britain, and Germany were closing their borders against one of the largest migrant crises in centuries. The destabilization of Libya saw hundreds of thousands of African people seek asylum in Europe. This very conflict resulted in renewed slavery of African people forced into chains and free labor in the 21st century. Euro-American politics of borders and keeping the foreigners away were at the center of a new rising global order. Many people called it the return of fascism. They destabilized countries in the Middle East and Africa through brutal wars, and yet set out to build high walls to keep migrants of the very stranded countries away. It is therefore not shocking that China itself, when pressed under the crisis of pandemic which originate in their own country, could turn on the most vulnerable African migrants, blame them, and seek to cleanse their communities of black bodies. In Guangzhou, coronavirus is associated with black bodies. The reality is that this is also how Africa treats itself. Colonization, as Fanon explained, created the condition in which we look at ourselves through the eyes of the colonizers. When we see ourselves, when we see each other, we see the indignity and animality that the colonizer sees when they look at us. This is why the leadership of independent African countries has failed to break the chains that imprison the African mind. In the hands of their own leaders, Africans receive the same animal treatment that they get from China, Europe, and North America. When Africans criticize their leadership for corruption, nepotism, and dictatorship, the African leadership subjects them to the same brutal massacres, imprisonments, and brutality that manifested in other countries. The African migrants receive the same treatment we see in China, right here in South Africa. In Cape Town, African migrants who occupied the church for asylum were forced out by the city without any public outrage. In fact, each year, South Africans, together with their ANC leadership in government, engage in annual theaters and orgies of xenophobic violence against Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Congolese who live amongst us. From time to time, the properties of African migrants are looted, burned down, or destroyed. The South African Police Service leads countless raids on those it calls undocumented migrants who happen to be Africans all the time. They beat them, arrest them, transport them to the borders. All this happens without any public outrage. Today, people are everywhere on social media, outraged by what Chinese are doing, rightfully so. Yet this is precisely what they do to other Africans right here in South Africa. They celebrate and encourage the forced removals and deportation of African migrants right here in South Africa. The African body will never be treated with dignity far away when it fails to find a treatment of dignity here at home. The Chinese do to Africans what Africans do to each other here in Africa every day. This must tell us, all of us, that freedom cannot be realized in a single African country. No single African person can say they are free and hope to earn equal respect from the rest of the world when other Africans live in chains and indignity. African freedom means the freedom of all Africans wherever they are in the world. There is no South African freedom, peace and prosperity that can ever be achieved without the freedom, peace and prosperity of the whole African continent and diaspora. When financial and economic relief was communicated by President Ramaphosa, there was no mention of the continent and or all the African migrants who live amongst us. The food parcels and all grants are meant for South Africans only. Even the small businesses grants are structured for South Africans only. The migrants, even those who are registered with permanent residency, will be overlooked, excluded, and probably even deported during this COVID-19 crisis. This is the reason all other countries in the world will never see black lives as worthy of dignity, respect, and remorse. We do not feel remorse to each other right here on the continent. We do not feel solidarity for each other. Do you think small and big business of British citizens will not get tax relief from SARS? Do you think they will not get payment holidays from Standard Bank? Do you think the British citizens in America will not get financial help from the USA government? The answer is simple. They will, because white people look out for each other, and our own government loves white people more than black people. They see it as their duty to keep white people happy and safe, even at the expense of Africans in general. In all these interventions, in particular, interventions that provide food and temporary shelter for the most vulnerable of our people, we must not forget our brothers and sisters from neighboring countries who remain in our country during these difficult times. We must shelter everyone. We must feed everyone. We must make sure that everyone, despite their nationality, whether they have documentation or not, no one should find himself or herself without food because they are from Zimbabwe, Malawi, Lesotho, Botswana, Nigeria, and everywhere else in Africa. They are our own brothers and sisters. We must share the little we have in these times of crisis. Build our solidarity and unity with our African brothers and sisters in Africa, and all poor nations must receive our support. Our public health care in African continent is, as it is the case here in South Africa, it is broken and serves the few rich. There are countries that have less than 10 ventilators that are much needed during this period to fight COVID-19. Those that seems to have more, these medical equipment are concentrated in facilities that services the few. Other countries like Somalia do not have even a single ventilator. When we manufacture ventilators, masks, and all essentials, we must always think of our brothers and sisters in the African continent. Intensive care units is even far much less. The World Health Organization estimated that 44 countries in Africa have a total of 5,000 intensive care units. We must share both intellectual and fiscal infrastructure with African countries and all poor nations. We should be inspired by Cuba's medical internationalism guided by socialist values, values that put lives before profit at all times. We must all be grateful for the visionary leadership of Commandant Fidel Castro, who started Cuban medical internationalism more than 60 years ago. We thank the Cuban doctors who have gone to the front line and fight coronavirus. We also want to welcome them to South Africa. All interventions, including supporting industrialization and protection of our economy, must also take into account the much larger role South Africa must play in the African continent. All interventions to open the new kind of economy must open up the African economy before opening up to the West and Asia. All interventions that seeks to provide personal protection equipment must do so for our health workers here in South Africa and, where possible, for other African countries that do not have them. All interventions that seeks to ensure adequate supply of medicines and other necessary supplies to fight coronavirus here in South Africa must do so with Africa in mind. We condemn the cutting of the World Health Organization funding by Donald Trump. He must not politicize the COVID-19 and come to the party to save the world from this invisible enemy. We will not win the war against coronavirus here in South Africa while the rest of the continent and poor nations are losing the battle because we'll achieve nothing. We want to urge our governments and governments across the world to prioritize human life over profit and egos at this time. We want to remind our government that there is no economy without people, and any easing of economy to combat the spread of coronavirus must be based on the science and not profit. We salute our doctors, nurses, police, soldiers, petrol attendants, shopkeepers, and the frontline staff for your sacrifices. You are our real heroes. South Africans, please continue to stay at home. South Africans, continue to wash your hands. Hasta la victoria siempre. Victory is certain. I thank you. Mandla.
All right, so that was EFF leader Julius Malema delivering the EFF's message on Freedom Day, and basically some of the bigger takeaways of that speech, calling on the people of South Africa to be disciplined and adhere to the COVID-19 regulations. He also said that coronavirus has brought into sharp focus the inequalities in South Africa. Also speaking about the SAA issues and hitting out against the public enterprises minister there. Mr. Malema also talking about, I guess, warning the country, wants the country to be guarded against taking IMF and World Bank loans, saying rather look at unclaimed benefits from insurance companies, and also government must use their own reserves, among other suggestions. He also warned government against reopening too prematurely with regards to the economy. So that was the message from the CIC of the EFF, Julius Malema. Speaking about reopening the economy, you have less than an hour left to make your submissions on the lockdown risk-adjusted strategy. Government has put the draft framework in the public domain.